Imagine an actual Ironman race in 2020. Cody Beals down in Florida right now, getting ready for your first Ironman at the end of 2020. Talk about the very odd season you've just come through.
Yeah, Barry, it feels kind of surreal. This is first Ironman start line in over a year. A degree of imposter syndrome was starting to set in. I appreciated the local racing opportunities, some of what you put on back in Ontario. But being here, stepping off the plane to the sunny weather and the excitement of a race, it feels really good. It was definitely a challenging year. Like right off the bat, when the scope of the pandemic became apparent, my play was basically to take some downtime because I correctly predicted I'd have to set myself up for a very, very long season. And I know I can't maintain fitness for 10 months. And so here I am racing later than I ever have in November. And I'm hoping that that early break around March and April will set me up for a very strong back half of the season here.
This is not a simple field. I mean, to think of how big this field is, obviously some of it has to do with just the number of events people had, but this is a very serious field you've got this weekend.
Yeah, it's kind of the de facto Pan American Championships. Ironman didn't put that stamp on it, but basically I was originally targeting Ironman Arizona, which was supposed to happen a couple weeks from now. That race abruptly got canceled. Ironman Portugal abruptly got canceled as well. And so this Ironman Florida race kind of amalgamated all these pro fields from three different Ironmans. And it's a truly world-class international high-caliber field here. I think we have about 50 guys on the start list or close to that.
Now, we're going to just kind of go in generally, you know, there's so many great things that you have done in your career, and I've watched you starting in Ontario and lots of the multi-sport racing that yourself and Jackson and Taylor and Lionel did, and, you know, so great to have that grassroots opportunity in our own province over those years. But as you started to make those international steps, you obviously had to start racing outside of the province and then even outside of the country. Yet Canada really has treated you incredibly well with those two big victories at Mount Tremblant. Just talk about how much energy you get racing in your own country, whether it was at multisport or, you know, at Mount Tremblant.
So I got my start racing locally in Ontario. Before even triathlon, I was dabbling in local running races. Before I had any university running background or anything like that. There was this awesome, vibrant running scene my parents were involved with. Same with cycling. So that's how I got my start, just in these like very small time, little tiny races around Fergus, Ontario, where I grew up. Some of these races had 25 finishers or something like that. And not long after, kind of in my mid-late teens, I found my way to triathlon and found the Subaru Series and the Multisport Canada Triathlon Series. And it was awesome. The Multisport Canada Tri Series had this elite pro circuit set up, and Lionel came up through that. Same with Jackson Laundry. Taylor Reed did some racing there. And that tradition of like awesome, vibrant, elite local racing has persisted. I know you put on some races this summer, and we were all really grateful for those racing opportunities. And so that's kind of how I cut my teeth. And it set me up really well. Like I really bided my time taking my elite card and starting to race internationally. But having had these proving grounds in Ontario, I was able to hit the ground running, so to speak, when I started racing internationally, and had top 5 finishes in my first pro season right away, and not long after some wins.
If you take a look, part of what our objective with you today and Joanna are to kind of, what did you do that you wished you had done differently? So generally we're like praising you for being brilliant and how smart you are and how many great decisions. But most of the listeners, to this clinic have made 100 bad mistakes, whether it's been through nutrition, too many races up in their mileage. And so it's great to understand that even the best, like the guy who owns the record at Ironman Mount Tremblant, Cody Beals, has actually done a few things that's not overly intelligent. So maybe you can share with us a couple of those lessons that, if you look back and you say, boy, I really learned out of that, and here's what I've kind of taken out of that situation and going to do a little different. Can you think back to some of those lessons from your career?
Oh, Barry, I'm glad I at least give the impression that I have my act together. But there have been, I actually struggled to even keep this to a list of 2 biggest mistakes.
You can add a couple more, not a problem.
My career is absolutely littered with huge mistakes. And looking back, I kind of marvel at how I arrived at where I'm at. I would say I kept these pretty general, just overarching principles where I really screwed up. And I'll offer some more specific examples too. So the first one came to mind pretty easily. I think looking back, let's flash back 10 years. I was dabbling in varsity running at Queen's University, focused on school, getting seriously into triathlon. And I had this really like ruggedly individualistic mentality. And I think triathlon draws a certain type of person like that in a lot of cases. And I really thought that I could be a lone wolf and be a self-taught expert in every aspect of the sport. I didn't need anyone's help. I was going to make it as far as I could all by myself. And that was going to somehow add to my accomplishments if I did it all by myself. Like accepting the help of other people would somehow cheapen whatever I was accomplishing. That was my very sorely misguided mentality at the time. So in university, it was a really dark period of my life. I isolated myself. I trained mostly alone. I didn't seek out help from doctors, from mental health professionals that I needed. I isolated myself with respect to my social circle, which was healthy in high school, but just contracted down to basically me and my training grind in university. And it had really insidious negative repercussions outside the sport. Like forget triathlon. It was not physically or mentally healthy for my life in general. So after I graduated, there were a whole host of things wrong. My mental health was in shambles. I was like chronically anxious. I had bad insomnia. And my physical health was also pretty horrendous too. So working with a sports doctor finally in Guelph, I was really presented with this concrete evidence that something was really, really wrong. And that was in the form of relative energy deficiency in sport, which is this newly coined term, basically describing a generalized form of what used to be called the female athlete triad, but in male athletes. And it's like this catch-all thing that encompasses things like low bone density, osteopenia, hormonal disturbances, unexplained chronic fatigue, what used to kind of be stamped with the term overtraining syndrome, I guess. And it was so apparent looking at my blood work and my test results, my bone density. And so that triggered this epiphany. And I realized, triathlon may be this individual sport, but it really takes a team of people around you to reach your potential. And over the decade that followed, it's hard to believe now I'm 30, I can't say that epiphany triggered like a sudden suite of changes overnight, but gradually I started to surround myself with this team that was really instrumental to my success. And it kind of took a complete paradigm shift in how I approached not only the sport, but also my life in general. All these holistic changes, taking on a coach, no longer self-coaching. I had to fire myself. I had to hand over the reins to someone else, working with a sports doctor, a dietitian to get my disordered eating habits on track. And then, embracing the idea of having training partners, working informally with Craig Taylor's squad here in Guelph, training partners like Taylor Reed, a C3 alum, and Jack Laundry, my two best friends in Guelph. And not to mention, getting serious about actually building a social life outside the sports. Not my entire identity is wrapped up in the sport. And, accepting the support of my partner and my family. And so now being on the start line here at Ironman Florida, I feel like I only deserve a fraction of the credit for getting myself here. It's really been built on the back of all these other people over the years. So that's probably the single biggest screw up in my career. Thinking I could be this lone wolf, thinking I could teach myself everything there was to know about the sport. And man, how wrong was I?
That's a really fantastic story to hear. And it's something that I actually see more often in the longer distance racing. I think the nature of kind of ITU drafting, juniors needing to be on a bike on a wheel of another person. You saw that this summer, these groups of young juniors that are kind of working together. But I definitely have seen over the years where age groupers and even pros that were doing long distance racing had this sense, look, I've got to go put a 5-hour bike ride in. I'll do it on my own. I'm going to go do my 34K run or whatever the case may be. So it's great to hear that, you can be both a support person for somebody like, Taylor or Jackson. Do you feel like when you guys are in that environment that you are both benefiting yourself as well as each other? Like, because you could imagine that when you get to the top level, 3 pros like you guys, if somebody thinks, I don't want to let Jackson get any stronger, so, I don't want to work hard with him on the bike because if he benefits, one day I'm going to have to race that guy for prize money. How do you view that when you guys are out there training together?
It's a really interesting dynamic, Barry, and it actually took years to establish the correct dynamic, I would say. So I've gotten together with lots of other pros to train with them, and usually the default dynamic is you're trying to beat the tar out of each other. And that can be productive sometimes. There are sessions where you want to smash yourself and it's super motivating to have someone else right there with you. But if you're going to train with someone day in, day out, like I do with Jack and Taylor, where we're often training together, every other day at least, multiple sessions a week, that's not a sustainable dynamic, That doesn't fit in any kind of properly periodized, sustainable approach to training. So the next level of our relationship as training partners and each other's support network, I would say, is actually not always pushing each other, but almost like being each other's sounding board and even aspects of each other's coaches on a daily basis. So instead of saying, Jackson, I'm doing one more interval. Are you game? Maybe I'm saying, Jackson, you look like hell today. Maybe you should not do this last interval because I know you've had a heavy week and you're stressed out right now, because I know what's going on in your life. So it's kind of that level of accountability, not just to push each other, but also to make sure we're dotting the I's and crossing the T's with every other aspect of keeping our training plan and our lives on track as well. So I'm really proud of the three of us for kind of achieving that dynamic. And I don't think as early 20-somethings we could have done that. It's taken a little bit of age and maturity to reach that dynamic, I think.
That's such a great story. And I think you are right. You definitely see when, certain athletes get together, it's harder. What were your watts, that kind of thing, particularly if it's supposed to be an easier recovery day. So we've got the first learning lesson that being the lone wolf, and not accepting help and asking for help was a massive problem. What other kind of things have you learned when you've looked back on your lessons?
So the second one, if I was to consolidate it down to two things, I had to kind of rack my brain for the best second mistake I made after that first one. And I would say it's that I've always been very conservative, even fearful when it comes to taking risks or leaps, not just in sport, but also in my life. And I've not tended to stray too far outside my comfort zone. And this has kind of been a double-edged sword. Like sometimes there's a time and place for that approach, and sometimes it served me really well. Like I alluded to before, I hit the ground running in my first pro season and made money right away. The flip side of that is that I could have been, having podium results and making prize money even earlier. My last race as an age grouper, I beat like 2/3 of the pro field or something like that. So maybe I waited too long. Same with my Ironman Mont Tremblant debut there, where I won and set a course record in my first Ironman. I resisted pressure for years to step up to the full distance. And so maybe it was a master stroke to wait, and some people kind of framed it like that. But I looked at that as like, could I have won an Ironman the year before, 2 years before? Could I have been at a podium 3 years before? Like, these are unanswered questions. So sometimes that approach has served me well, but by and large, I would say not, that fearful risk mitigation oriented approach has really held me back a lot of times. Most notably, I would say it's manifested in being really conservative with how I select races and often shying away from the most competitive races. So I don't regret building my career with podiums and wins at kind of B or C tier races. The entire financial incentives of the sport reward wins. And so that's what I chased for years. But I avoided some of the biggest days of our sport, like regional championships, like 70.3 world championships, like Challenge Roth. And as a result, when I found myself on the Kona start line last year, I was a bit of a train wreck. Like I was so ill-equipped to handle that pressure cooker environment because I had not had like the next rung up the ladder from these small races I was winning to the mid-level races like regional championships to Kona. I jumped straight from, the Ironman 70.3 Eaglemans of the world to the biggest stage in our sport. And long story short, it chewed me up and spat me out in so many ways in the month leading up to the race, and especially during race week.
Well, you and I flew over to Hawaii on the same flight, and I'll just steal a little bit of that story, but to kind of support what you just said, I could tell when we were chatting coming off the plane, having worked with athletes in Hawaii for 25 years, you had a workload of about 18 hours of booth time. I got to go to this booth and do this for that sponsor. I got to go do this. I got to run these, people off in a contest and then go see Breakfast with Bob and do. And so, it wasn't a surprise to me that, you were tired before the race started because you just went to the biggest show in the world and you were like the guy walking down Vegas with all the neon lights flashing all over the place.
My first day there, I did an hour-long, ridiculously hard run up and down a Lee Drive. Got the worst sunburn of my life. Like, what a complete rookie! Yeah. So, and I would say like that approach of being conservative and incremental and fearful also is shown up in how I execute races. Like I've lost races, finished second place or third place, and the winner looks way more spent than I do. I'm like the freshest guy at the finish line, and that's not a boast or a point of pride. That shows poor execution. Like maybe my central governor, if you buy into that theory, was just set a little too conservatively. So it's taken me a long time to embrace the mentality of taking risks in racing, because even Ironman racing at times rewards risk taking. Not always, but there are certain calculated risks you have to be comfortable learning how to take. And I've also just not even shown up to races unless I feel like the utmost confidence in my prep. And that's kind of an element of perfectionism that gets into that. This also touches heavily on perfectionism, which has also kind of been a double-edged sword and a major theme in my life. So I've missed out on a lot of opportunities just because I didn't feel like I could bring my A game. But you know what? Maybe my B plus game would have been good enough. Maybe it would have been good enough to get the experience I needed to make a bit of money and to have a good time. So there are definitely regrets there. So I think the lesson from this for me is that reflecting back on some of those examples I gave, there's definitely a time to be conservative, to be cautious, to be pragmatic. But there's also really a time to go for it. And this Ironman Florida race reflects me going for it. I was extremely conflicted about traveling during an international pandemic, flying here on election day, no less. There were so many variables. My prep was so crunched down after the cancellation of Ironman Arizona. But you know what? Everything was pointing to me that I shouldn't be here. But after this dumpster fire of a season, I was so eager to salvage something that I'm here. It was time to roll the dice. It's time to throw that conservative playbook out the window and just go for it.
Johnny's got a question for you from one of our viewers. John, go ahead.
Well, this might be a ringer question from one of our, I don't know for sure. It's from a guy called Bob. Bob asks Cody, where do you see your career 5 to 7 years, 20 years, and maybe even 40 years from now?
Wow, 5 to 7 years from now, I'm still going to be racing. And I really questioned that heavily this year. You know, I admitted publicly that I thought about retiring this year with the pandemic. I think a lot of pro triathletes did. The future of the sport was uncertain, despite some glimmers of hope, like our new professional triathletes organization, for example. So after kind of examining that and soul searching, I realized that if I retired now or next year, I would leave the sport with so much unfinished business. And if there's one thing I'm afraid of, it's retiring with regret. So I'm in this for the long haul. I'm only 30, and only in long course triathlon of all the sports can you say only 30. So I'm just entering my peak years in Ironman racing. So 5 to 7 years, I want to be racing Kona or whatever the biggest world stage happens to be at the time, and eking out every last little bit of performance. 20 years, you know, I can't say that I'm still going to be involved as actively with the sport as I am now. I think I have a lot of other things I want to do in life, and I have the utmost respect for coaching and what it takes to be a good coach. But that's kind of like the default trajectory for a retired pro triathlete, is just to get into coaching. Exercise science fascinates me. I could see myself doing that, but I don't think it would be the centerpiece of my career. Likewise with commentating about the sport. I think I'm going to be doing something else unrelated to triathlon, but I hope I keep my foot in the door after all that the sport's given to me. I definitely owe the sport some giving back as well. And likewise with 40 years, I can't even speculate out that far, you know, like as an 18-year-old, I prided myself in having this master plan for the next 10 years of my life. And it didn't involve triathlon at all. I barely even knew about the sport. So the lesson there was that life can take some sharp lefts, and sometimes they're fascinating and wonderful and unanticipated. So I've stopped trying to predict what's going to light my fire in 10 years or 5, let alone 40.
Cody, I want to thank you. I hope you realize that you're a part of a very special breed right now. It's the primest time to be a Canadian long distance male. You know, when you add Brent McMahon and all that he's done in his great career, when you add Taylor and Jackson, Jeff Simons getting back into the routine, and Lionel, you know, there was always kind of a Peter Reed or somebody coming along, but to have 4 or 5 men on any given weekend that could be on the podium carrying the maple leaf is a big deal. And we wish you best of luck this weekend in Florida. We'll be sending some good luck and hopefully a nice tailwind on that flat bike course.
Thank you very much, Barry. Definitely an exciting time to be in Canadian triathlon.
Awesome. Cody Beals getting ready for Ironman Florida this weekend.